Hello and welcome to yet another episode of the In-Depth series. Now, there has been a buzz around loan write-off. How is loan write-off different from the waiver or waive-off of loans? What are the implications of this particular move? Everything that is important from the perspective of your JS Mains paper 3rd as well as prelims paper has been discussed today in this particular segment. Let's move ahead and first of all talk about what is a loan write-off. Loan write-off means when the banks take off the loans away to be counted as an asset. That means the loans are assets, the deposits are liabilities. When the bank no longer considers any loan as an asset, it is known as writing off. That means it is removed from the books. What is an asset and a liability in a bank's balance sheet goes from the fact, what is a bank? It is an intermediary between depositors and those who are in need of loan. So bank is an intermediary. Suppose this is a bank. A is in a need of loan. B is a depositor. When B goes to bank X to deposit their money, B gets a particular amount of, suppose 6% of interest on their deposit for 5 years. Now, what does the bank do? Bank, with the help of this particular deposit, lends loan to customer A. And the bank charges, suppose 7% interest on loans. So, as you can see, there is a difference of 1% with respect to the depositing and the lending procedure. This 1% is actually the profit that banks get. So, when B has to need their money, they will go to the bank asking for their money. That is why deposit is basically a liability, okay? Because bank, according to their own balance sheet, owes the deposit to B, okay? And as the bank have this mindset that I have lent certain amount of rupees to Mr. A owes me the loan. That means it is an asset. So loans are an asset. Assets, what the bank owns, such as branch, building and everything else, plus what people owe to the bank, okay? According to the people's balance sheet, suppose here we are talking about the balance sheet of A, this is loan is a liability. For banks, it is an asset. So that could go from loans, mortgages and overdraft. And liabilities are basically what the banks have to pay to the depositors. So that is a liability. Okay. Now we see how does it help the bank. Now if we talk about how does it help the bank, we have to keep two things in mind. As an asset, whenever a loan is not getting serviced, in the sense interest is not being paid on a certain loan for an amount of time, it is known as a non-performing asset. It can be divided into three categories: substandard, doubtful and loss asset. Substandard assets are those assets which have remained non-performing asset for a period less than or equal to 12 months. Doubtful assets are those assets which have remained in the substandard category for a period of 12 months. And then comes the loss asset. These are considered uncollectible. The higher the amount of time taken, it is now uncollectible and of such little value that its continuance as a bankable asset is not warranted. So when this category of NPA comes across, the banks, they write it off, not showing it as an asset anymore because it is uncollectible. So banks can reduce the level of NPA on its books. It's not existing in the books now. So what will happen? There is not the burden of showing it in the books, non-performing assets. And similarly, as the amount has been written off, it reduces the tax liability of the bank for the government, because it will say that, see government, I do not have any asset to pay you tax. So now what happens? That the revenue of the government also gets lost. If we talk about the rise and fall of NPAs, you can gauge it from 2011 to 2022. This is from March 2022 from RBI. Okay. So as we see, Among these many years, in 2018, there has been a peak of 11.50%, but it has reduced now, maybe because of recapitalization. This can be seen. Now, when do banks decide to write off their loans? Let's talk about that. When a borrower has defaulted their loan repayment and it is now no longer, considerable and reasonable to show it as an asset, they decide to do it. And when there is a very low chance of recovery, that means it's a loss asset. The lender then moves the defaulted loan. The lender here is the bank. The defaulted loan out of the asset side, and then they will say this amount is a loss. Okay. Moving ahead, now, is there any chance of recovery, or the banks just write it off and then they are no longer interested in the recovery? There is a chance of recovery because the banks are supposed to continue their efforts, because eventually, even if you write it away, it will still be a loss. So banks are supposed to continue their efforts to recover the loan using various options. They also make provisioning. Provisioning means a certain amount will be set aside for it as a cushion. And the problem comes when the government thinks about, if it is a case of a PSU, even a private bank, what kind of asset or collateral do the banks have against which they are lending the loans? So if the asset, banks do not want to get into all the sort of hassle of selling land and then recovering their money and everything. So what kind of asset have you, taken as a collateral? That comes into the question. And what are the prudent policies that you are following when you are lending the loans? Why are these loans becoming NPAs? Okay. Moving ahead, now if we have to talk about writing off versus waiving off, let's see the difference. A loan write-off is when the banks write off the loan to clean up the balance sheet, but the loan account stays in their book as they hope to recover it at a later date. But if we talk about waive off, it is a complete cancellation. There is not any chance of getting it back. A loan write-off means that the loan account is not closed, which means that the lender can try to recover the loan amount with the help of a legal entity. In the case of waiver, the banks will not attempt to take any legal action against the borrowers. Writing off any collateral given by the borrower will either be confiscated until the borrower makes the repayment. Alternatively, the collateral is auctioned off to recover the loan amount. In case of waiver, the borrower has offered any If the borrower has offered any sort of collateral, their ownership papers will be returned to them. Then comes write-off. Write-off is a lawful process. It is carried out by the banks to reduce their tax liabilities. Waiver is a facility provided by the government to generally we see the farmers when there is a natural calamity. The writing off is a practice carried out by lending institutions on their own frequently, but this is voluntary waiving off and it needs the support of the government. Moving ahead, let's talk about the other important part of it, that is the implication. As I've already told you that they are not going to show it as an asset, the banks, so they do not need to pay any sort of tax. That decreases the government's revenue, which they could receive as tax. Then what happens? No revenue. That will create very many challenges for the economy. If government has no revenue, then how will government undertake the developmental activities and investment? And eventually, the government will be responsible for paying the amount which has been written off. No availability for the needy. Sometimes it can also occur because the banks are writing off the loans. It is eventually the depositor's money, our money. But if the loans have been written off, it can be seen as now the bank doesn't have any money to actually lend it to those who are genuine persons who need loan. Recapitalization in this case does not occur, does not happen to be of any use because there has been a hole that has been created by the non-performing assets. Just by recapitalizing it is not much of a profit. Also, such banks record low deposit rate. I would not want to deposit in any bank which has a high, you can say, writing off frequency, because of course it is eventually the depositor's money which the banks are lending. What if the bank goes bankrupt Alright, moving ahead now, if we have to talk about the current situation from the prism of private banks, they wrote off loans worth rupees 2,74,772 crore in the last 5 years. That is 27.28% of the total write-offs of rupees 10,09,510 crore of the banking sector. Now, in 2018-19, private sector wrote off 53,000 crore. In 2019-2020, 58,293 crore. ICICI Bank leads in the private sectors when it comes to reduction in non-performing assets, in the sense they are writing off the loan, with rupees 50,514 crore in the last 5 years. Axis Bank, rupees 49,715 crore, and of course the same amount of year. Then HDFC Bank, rupees 34,782 crore. Moving ahead, if we talk about public sector banks, they have the lion's share of writing off of loans. 738 crore, which is 72.78% of the banking sector. State Bank of India leads here with rupees 204,486 crore in the last 5 years, followed by Punjab National Bank with rupees 67,214. and Bank of Baroda rupees 66,711 crore. If we have to talk about any sort of initiatives that banks have been established in order to take care of non-performing assets, because this is a financial entity which is set up to buy non-performing assets by the bank so that they can have their daily business not affected by non-performing assets. Now this entity purchases the bad banks from the commercial banks, and then they try to restructure the loans and sell the NPA to investors who need them, who might be interested in purchasing it. If they are able to sell, if the bad bank is able to sell off the loan at a higher amount than they have purchased it from the commercial banks, then they get a profit. But profit is not the primary motive. It can be a secondary motive. The primary one is to ensure that the banks, commercial banks, are doing their business with ease. Alright. Moving ahead, now if we talk about standard of procedure, how do they work? There are two entities that have been created, NARCL and DRCL. NARCL is going to acquire and aggregate the identified NPA account, but DRCL will handle the debt resolution process. So this works as a principal agent in a principal agent model. Okay, and they have a debt management agreement. Also, the final approval, as NARCL is the principal here, final approval for the resolution will lie with NARCL only. Alright, so I hope you understood everything. I tried to make sure that everything is integrated and most understandable in nature. Thank you so much for watching and stay updated.